You know, even when I was an atheist, I loved Christmas time because I managed to focus on all the superficial trappings of the holiday instead of the spiritual dimension. I mean, what's not to like about Christmas? You got gift giving, you've got holiday parties, you get cards from relatives and friends. I mean, I was like anybody else. I loved sitting by the warm fireplace, sipping on some hot chocolate, or back in those days, probably something a little more potent, and enjoying time with family and relatives and friends. I think lots of people like me just enjoy the sentimental side of the season. In fact, many of my atheist buddies would rank the Christmas season as one of their favorite times of the year. But after my wife Leslie became a Christian, and I started to investigate the identity of Jesus, I began to probe into the real meaning of those nativity scenes that I'd see outside of churches. I wanted to separate the holiday from the holy day, the facts from the fantasy, the truth from the tradition, and get down to the historic bedrock of what Christmas is all about. What I found thoroughly fascinated me. I mean, I expected to discover that Christmas is built on flimsy legends that developed in the many decades after Jesus lived. I thought the virgin birth would be exposed as some sort of fanciful idea that was plagiarized from earlier mythology. I didn't anticipate that the opposite would happen, that a thorough investigation of the ancient history would validate the Christmas narrative, because it's based on reliable sources that are too immediate to be written off as being mere legend or make-believe. So I'd like to share some of what I learned with you. I'm so glad that you're joining me for this 4-week experience as we set aside Santa Claus and Christmas trees and delve instead into the question of what we can really know with confidence about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a journey that I'm convinced will stimulate your mind, it'll warm your heart, it'll satisfy your soul, and forever, I believe it will change the way that you celebrate Christmas. It is, after all, the greatest story of history. And as you know, the greatest stories of history are the ones that turn out to be true. When we investigate Christmas, we not only have to separate the commercial aspects of Christmas from the spiritual roots of the holiday, but we also need to drill down deeply into the historical record to determine exactly what did take place in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. Because sometimes we find that legends have contaminated the actual account of what really took place. Let me give you an example. Here's the storyline we typically hear at Christmas, even in many of our churches. To comply with a census being conducted by the Roman Emperor Augustus, Joseph and the pregnant Mary set out on a donkey to go to Bethlehem, since Joseph was a descendant from the house of David. The baby starts to arrive as they approach the village, so they urgently are seeking shelter. But the mean old innkeeper tells them there's no vacancy. That is, there's no room for them at the inn. And this forces Mary and Joseph into a nearby stable or cave where Mary gives birth amongst the animals. The child is then wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger. Sounds familiar, right? And yet, as I investigated Christmas, I found that that's probably not exactly what happened in terms of how Luke describes the real Christmas. First, it would have been unthinkable in the first century for anyone to turn away a pregnant Jewish woman who was seeking shelter. I mean, hospitality was such an extremely high value in those days. In fact, one scholar said to turn away a descendant of David in the city of David would be an unspeakable shame on the entire village. The person who turned her away would be ostracized from the community. Second, and I'm sorry if I pop any bubbles or meddle with any Christmas carols here, but there was probably no inn and probably no innkeeper. Yeah, there were some commercial lodgings that were available in the first century, but probably not in Bethlehem. It was a small community, and it wasn't on a major road. Besides, many scholars doubt whether Luke is talking about a hotel at all. You see, the Greek word that many Bibles translate as inn is katalima. This word is used twice in the New Testament, where Luke and Mark describe the place where the Last Supper was held. Now, in that instance, the word clearly means a spare or upper room in a private house. Now, if Luke had wanted to describe a commercial lodging of some sort, he had another Greek word he certainly would have used. But he didn't use that other Greek word. He did when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. But here, Luke specifically chose the word katalima to talk about the birth of Jesus. And katalima is best translated as guest room. In fact, the NIV Bible translates Luke 2, verse 7, as saying that Mary gave birth, wrapped Jesus in cloths, and placed him in a manger, quote, because there was no guest room available for them. Many scholars say this is the most accurate translation. In fact, as far back as the year 1395, John Wycliffe's translation of Luke 2, verse 7, rendered katalima as a chamber or a room, not some sort of commercial inn. But then subsequent translations, for some reason, and that includes the King James Version, use the word inn, and that's become part of our Christmas culture. Now, in his book, Urban Legends of the New Testament, scholar David Croteau describes how first-century homes looked in the Middle East. There was generally one large room broken down into two parts. There was the family room, where cooking and eating and sleeping took place. And then there were a few steps down to the animal room, where the family donkey, cow, and a sheep or two would be kept. Now, these animals were brought inside the last thing at night, and they're taken outside the first thing in the morning. Now, this floor in the animal room was slanted toward the outside for easy cleaning. But sometimes the larger animals would come up the stairs into the family room. And so each area had its own manger or feeding trough, which was usually built into the floor and filled with hay for the animals to eat. Now, here's the thing. Some houses added a second room off the family room, which was called the guest room, and it would have had its own exterior entrance. This was the katalima that Luke was referring to. There was no room for Mary and Joseph in the katalima, the guest room. What's more, Mary apparently wasn't on the verge of giving birth as she and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. This idea can be traced back to an apocryphal work of fiction called the Protevangelium of James, which is from the 2nd century. It's a work that doesn't have any connection to James, who was a half-brother of Jesus, or James the Apostle. It's mostly legendary stuff. Again, we have to pay close attention to what Luke reports, since he was writing much closer to the events after interviewing eyewitnesses. In fact, Luke says in the prologue of his gospel that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so he could write an orderly account of the certainty of what took place. Well, Luke chapter 2, verse 6 says that, quote, the time for the baby to be born came, quote, while they were there in Bethlehem. Luke doesn't portray this as being an urgent or emergency situation that occurred as they were approaching the village. As one scholar said, he doesn't mention whether they were there for 5 minutes or 5 weeks, but it could allow for both. In other words, there was probably no panic involved. Oh, and one more thing. What about the idea that Mary gave birth in a cave? Actually, the Gospels don't mention a cave at all. In fact, the idea of a cave can be traced back to Christian apologist Justin Martyr, who was writing much later. He was writing in the middle of the 2nd century. So, what really happened on that first Christmas? Well, Joseph and the pregnant Mary arrived in Bethlehem to register for the census. They went to the house of a friend or a relative, but there was no room for them in the guest room, probably because of the crowd of people who'd already arrived for the census. So they were invited to stay in their family room, where Mary gave birth, and the child was placed in the clean hay of a feeding trough, where he was subsequently encountered by the shepherds who had been alerted to his birth by the angels. Now, these are, I think, fascinating details, but the bottom line truth of Christmas remains unchanged. Jesus gave up his throne in heaven to enter into our world as a baby lying in a manger. Now, it's a legitimate question to ask whether we can trust the gospel accounts. How do we know they're telling us the truth? How do we know that they're reliable? Can we be sure that they're trustworthy when they describe the birth, the teachings, the death, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus? Well, I started out as a skeptic, but I eventually emerged convinced that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are accurate in what they tell us about Jesus. After all, each of these fall within the historical genre of ancient biographies, which were intended, to one degree or another, to report what actually took place in the life of a notable person. And as I've demonstrated in my books, these Gospels bear the earmarks of accuracy. First, they were written a lot closer to the events they describe than some of the critics claim. How do we know? Well, let's consider the Gospel of Luke, which has the most details about the birth of Jesus. Luke was a physician and close companion of the Apostle Paul. Scholars agree that he wrote the book of Acts, which describes the early spread of Christianity. But the book ends unfinished because its central figure, Paul, is under house arrest in Rome. Now, we don't find out from Acts what happens to Paul. And beyond that, Acts doesn't describe several other major events that happened in the AD 60s, like the martyrdom of Peter and James, and the Roman-Greco War, and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. So, Acts was apparently written before those events occurred, meaning that we can date it before about AD 62. Now, we know that Acts is the second of a two-part work written by Luke, the earlier one being the Gospel of Luke. So we can date the Gospel of Luke to around AD 60, or perhaps a little bit earlier. Now, keep in mind that Jesus was killed in AD 30 or 33. So we're talking about a very short time gap. And we know that one of Luke's sources was Mark. So his gospel is even earlier. Now, this dating is especially significant when you consider that one of the greatest historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford University, determined that in the ancient world, the passage of 2 generations of time was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And yet, Luke's gospel was written within the same generation when Jesus lived. A second reason we can trust the Gospels is that archaeology has consistently affirmed the biblical record, to the point where Luke has been described by scholars as a first-rate historian. In fact, sometimes skeptics have believed that Luke was wrong about something, only to have later discoveries prove that, well, Luke was right after all. Let me just give you an example. Luke says that after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, he grew up in Nazareth. Yet, skeptics claim for years that Nazareth didn't even exist in the first century. They cite the fact that Nazareth isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, it's not mentioned by the Apostle Paul or in the Jewish Talmud. In fact, no historians mention it before the beginning of the 4th century. However, in 2006, the Nazareth Archaeological Project began excavating beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. And guess what they found? A house from the era of Jesus. What's more, inside they discovered limestone vessels, which Jews believe could not become impure. Now, what does this suggest? This suggests this was a Jewish home, right there in Nazareth from Jesus' era. 3 years later, guess what happened? Another house from Jesus' days was unearthed nearby. Once again, Luke was shown to have been exactly correct. Nazareth did exist in Jesus' day. So there are good reasons to trust Luke and the other Gospels as well when they tell us about Jesus. But then why don't Mark and John describe the birth of Jesus? Some skeptics have said that the absence of a birth narrative in those two Gospels, as well as in the writings of the Apostle Paul, undermines the historical record about how Jesus entered the world. But this, friends, is an argument from silence. And arguments from silence are notoriously unconvincing. Not all the Gospels report each and every event in Jesus' life. In fact, John, being the last Gospel that was written, doesn't repeat a lot of the material that was already known in the earlier Gospels, including the Sermon on the Mount. Yet, interestingly, someone who tradition tells us was personally mentored by John the Apostle surely emerged believing in the virgin birth. His name was Ignatius, and he became the bishop of Antioch. Now, in the year AD 108, he wrote a letter in which he explicitly says that Jesus was, quote, truly born of a virgin. Now, where did he learn that from? Could it be that he learned it from his mentor, the author of the Gospel of John? As for Mark, he simply doesn't deal with Jesus' early years in his Gospel. That's a literary choice he made. However, he does implicitly reference the unusual nature of Jesus' birth when he quotes someone in Mark 6, verse 3, as referring to Jesus as, quote, the son of Mary. Now, normally, a Jewish person would be identified with his father's name, even if his dad were deceased. But here we have an implicit acknowledgement that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. Something was unusual about his birth. As for why the Apostle Paul doesn't mention the circumstances of Jesus' birth, the answer is that it simply wasn't relevant to the issues that prompted him to write the epistles. Besides, Paul doesn't mention a lot of details about Jesus that are already covered in the Gospels. For instance, he never mentions Mary or Joseph or Nazareth. So, are we to presume they didn't exist? Of course not. So, what have we learned so far? That the historical record of the birth of Jesus needs to be taken seriously. The Gospels are our best source about what really took place 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary. If it were all a fairy tale, akin to Santa Claus and elves, we could dismiss it as merely being, a childhood fantasy without any practical implications for our lives. But because it's true, Christmas cannot be ignored. In the end, the child in the manger deserves our allegiance, and he deserves our worship. I'm struck in the end by the humility displayed by Jesus in his birth. Here he is, the eternal God who created the entire universe. And as John 1 verse 14 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He entered into our world in the most primitive and unpretentious way. As Philippians 2:7 describes it, Christ Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And that should tell you and me that whatever our circumstances, no matter how modest, no matter how dire, no matter how difficult, Jesus offers to enter into our world and to bring his grace and his truth into our individual situation. As Christian author Philip Yancey put it, as I read the birth stories about Jesus, I cannot help but conclude that though the world may be tilted toward the rich and powerful, God is tilted toward the underdog. If you haven't invited Jesus into your life, or if you haven't turned over your worries or your problems to Him, then I hope that by the end of this study, that you will. Believe me, that would make this the best Christmas of all.